Hi, welcome to the last lecture of Design for Equitable Systems. Woo woo. At least this cycle. Unless you're making more content, email me. Let's figure it out. We're going to talk today about responsibly growing your efforts. So taking all the work that you've done, all the things that you've worked on over the past, few lectures to, moving on and building, a movement as we talked about last lecture. So your readings today will be talking about funding, and we'll also be talking about advocacy, as today's lecture is about financials as well as advocating for this process in the institutions that we occupy to ensure that community-driven practices are more included in our structures, which is essentially disrupting the current status quo. So a review of last lecture, pitching and sharing interventions. We talked about old power versus new power, especially in building successful movements. We talked about the ways that people are drawn to movements and how today's movements are being more inclusive, more operationalized, more peer-driven, led by the many, and open to all. And I like to say that this is efforts that put people back in control of their destinies. So remember that for any of these movements, you're looking for the right people who can connect to you and meet you where you are to ensure takeoff. And we talked about this idea of takeoff in bringing people who can not only text and do the easiest level of things, but can also start to move up the participation scale to become leaders and organizers themselves and even shape the movement. And how this moves away from the old power where people just, consume things and comply with the status quo, but aren't part of changing the systems that be, which is really, really inspiring to see this is the work that we're moving towards. And we also talked about connecting with funders and resources and what might those questions you need to ask yourself as you're identifying the areas of support that are essential to growing your work. And one of the best points that I think is important to take away from that last lecture is just being ambitious in what your intervention needs and knowing that you deserve that support. That is a critical value to have throughout any pitching effort, sharing effort, movement building effort, is that you've done all the work to ensure that this is community-centered and this is going to make the change that you want. So you need to push it forward believing that this intervention deserves the attention of all the people that you're working for. So we're going to do our funding. So I did cover funding a little bit. Pitching is a central technique to use for funders. You can ask questions about the things, the money that's available out there, how much money do you need, what things do you need to fund. But I want to talk today kind of about what's out there right now. Now, this list is limited because funding for social impact, I would say, is a very, it's a space that needs radical revisioning because it is very white and heteronormative, but it's at least good to understand some of these techniques that currently exist. Funding is often one of the main barriers to early stage interventions, especially in social impact. Money is usually given to the status quoers, the people already in control. And so you need to understand what the funding space is to know what's best for you in your early stage work. So I'll talk about 3 levels, and each has their pluses and their minuses. So there's the initial funding sources. Now, often these are highly inequitable because they rely on resources that the people themselves have or have in their network. So, commonly in entrepreneurship, we talk about bootstrapping or funding that for yourself. Now, obviously, if you don't have a lot of money, this is really hard to do. And even tapping into your inner network is really difficult if those around you also don't have money. So I will say right now I've been self-funding and getting some grants for this project, but know that it's not something that I can continue into the long term. And often this is what will stop some efforts if they can't move past this stage. The next stage is some early stage momentum. Now, these are often more selective in their approach and will be really, critical of interventions And many of them, I will say, are not as equity-centered as they should be. Now, there's some out there like, Equity and Green, the Roddenberry Foundation, that have really incredible equity-focused fellowships, but some of these are often not built for community-centered work. But there's, crowdfunding. You could potentially use GoFundMe or some other community-driven platform, Facebook, to fund your efforts and grow attention. You can use competitions. This is, if you have a really perfect pitch, you can go into these competitions and share your ideas. And then I kind of have a third category of programs. So there's incubators, accelerators, and fellowships. Incubators are kind of more for, starting out your idea, doing it in a safe space of growth. Accelerators are in the kind of a growth stage venture, so something that is expanding and needs that kind of expansion support. And fellowships are often, for any stage of venture and come with all these come with funding. And kind of are more mentor-based and more programmatic than kind of accelerators or incubators. But these are ways to gain funding in a kind of early stage way when your effort is still kind of new and nascent. And the final form of impact is kind of scaling impact funding. So while some of this funding might be available in your earlier stages, it's going to be in smaller amounts than maybe once you're grown a bit more. But often it's really hard to access this as a community-driven effort because many of these funding sources were not built for equity-centered interventions. And we'll talk about in the next section about, the power structures involved in philanthropy as it stands. So if you're a for-profit idea, you can use equity or debts and loans. Angel investment might apply for both. Some more angel impact investors are focusing on both 501c3s, so nonprofits, as well as kind of more for-profit based ventures because they believe in the missions and ideas. And then if you want, you can also go for grants. So there are smaller form grants that might be more early stage, but some of the big bucks, that's funny, big bucks will go to big 501c3s. So that requires registration status or working with an existing organization. And something, again, while there's many ways to fund work, much of it is limited due to the old ways of philanthropy that doesn't value equity and has certain standards that often actually inhibit this justice work. So they're not perfect, but they're those that are out there that you can explore as you're thinking about the support needed for your intervention. How do I combat unequal power dynamics? Now, this is something, underinvested communities have been dealing with for years. Why am I always being researched? Why do I never have control? Why do people always come in and tell me what I need? This is just the old way of showcasing, these people with power and status saying that they know what's best for communities. And as an organizer that's working on community-driven efforts, you have kind of a key role in combating these structures. So issues with current funding, foundations are excessively holding privilege due to their financial status and often well-regarded because of their funding, basically, at the end of the day. And while they might have diversity in their efforts or, different staff members, much of the culture has been shaped by, white, heteronormative, cis, ideas of the world. And foundations as a whole are very risk-averse, which means they often avoid equity work because they're afraid of failing and afraid of not doing something right, and that fear keeps them from doing this work. And so we're really working up against a wall in doing those efforts because this is just not the way that many of the structures that support social ventures currently function. So we're going to be talking about 3 dimensions of power that are currently needing to be challenged and built out in order to build a system that's more equity-centered and allows for these community-driven practices to exist in a successful status. And so that's building power, sharing power, and wielding power. So building power is, allowing for underinvested communities to organize for themselves and the systemic change they need. Sharing power is allowing for trusting, co-creative relationships. And wielding power, allows for catalytic change by connecting people with public leaders who can grow efforts. So how to build power? How do we do this? Kind of 4 things I would like to cover. Be explicit with supporters that they should be prepared to advance systemic work. So You, again, when we talked about last time, you should not compromise on your values in this work. You deserve to be heard. This work deserves to be done. You've done more than many efforts have in terms of getting the community involved and engaged in building what they need to build. And so supporters need to be aligned with that and understand that. You need to make sure that voices of underinvested communities are uplifted, and it's not just the funders speaking for what they believe people want. Intersectionality, which your effort will likely be given its community-centered nature, making sure that underinvested communities don't compete for resources as many foundations make them do, which is a really inequitable structure. And make sure that you're working towards the long term. Many foundations are kind of short-term blips. They want to see something in a year or two, but that's just not how social change works. It takes many, many years of organizing. And so there has to be funding that builds that capacity so that organizers can continue to move forward towards a more equitable future for their community. How do we share power? How do you challenge people to share power? You need to work with people who are responsive, inclusive, and transparent with you. They need to be those supporters in your corner and not just the funder that throws money at you. Because otherwise, they're still holding the power while you're just beholden to their financial well-being. You are working with people who invest in your success and believe in you, which I think is essential. Funders might give you money, but if they don't believe in you, they're not going to support you, not going to connect you to those who believe in you. Not just getting the feedback from experts, as we've talked about before. Communities are their own experts. Their lived expertise is essential. And you need to be able to show that you need to radically share that effort. And make sure that you are included in decision making. You deserve to know what's going on because the money is advancing the efforts of a foundation once and doing it in a way that I believe is better than past practices. Finally, wielding power. So making sure that you're working with people that are okay stepping away from power or challenging them to step away from power when they're not needed. Making sure that they advocate to you to different power wielders. They say that you're an incredible effort and should be, more supported, should be grown. They connect with, they raise awareness. They support the underinvested communities that they're funding, and they uplift their voices over their own maybe white or heteronormative, narrative. And they will make sure that they're deploying investments that transfer power to communities. Because at the end of the day, communities could do things that they want if they had the funding. And if that funding was been stolen from them basically by those in power. And so it's about bringing that back to the communities. Again, know what you deserve as an organizer for justice. And that builds your power to show that this is work that will be transformative and will improve people's livelihoods, and it needs to be supported. Finally, how do we continue to advocate for this process? And if you're taking this course and you say, this is something everyone needs to know, how do I make sure that this becomes more of a practice in my company, my school, my local organization that I'm a part of? Here's some steps that hopefully will help you in building that change. Yeah. So advocacy is going to be that key skill that we're going to talk about to make that happen. So what is advocacy? Advocacy is an attempt to change policy, practice, or attitudes. So this is almost like, it's kind of a systemic change kind of thing. You have your policy and practices at the bottom, but you're also trying to change the attitudes of relationships and individuals. And it does that by presenting evidence and arguments for how and why change should happen. So you are building a solid narrative and points for why these practices will improve upon the current culture. So successful advocacy tips. It aligns with your goals and values. So you can showcase that this is essential to you. This is something that you care about, and it is part of kind of your mission as a community organizer. Know the goal and for the future, and know that it's unique. I know if you're advocating for these processes, they're quite unique and often not represented in many organizations, but often for anything, you'll want to know that it's something that, you don't want to recreate the wheel. If it is already being done, you want to support those that are doing the work and shape that work with them. You have a goal in mind and know that advocacy is a necessary step. So often in an institution of power, Advocacy is essential because you need to change the practices and the policies. And so that goal is to build towards that. You have specific objectives that can be met in a timely manner. So while we have our big pie in the sky goals of transforming the world, we need to make sure that we have steps to get there. And often it will be convincing one person, and then you convince another person, you convince another person. And you're sort of like kind of getting those objectives to work up to your main goal. Like as we talked about coalition building, decision makers, you know who has power and how to win them over. You understand what they value, you understand their tics, you understand what they care about, and you can use that to your advantage. You have a core translatable message. Maybe to get to those leaders, you have to build support among your other staff members, your other club members, your other community members. It might take the time to kind of have a catchy thing that can build that movement of support. You have evidence to back up your claims, and that claim will show your credibility. You can show data on why this is important. You can show stories on how this has benefited you. You can show how this has benefited other community members to show that this is why this action should be taken. You're cognizant of the resources necessary, especially if you're working alone. This might be taking a lot of your time. Make sure that you are emotionally and physically able to handle that effort. You're aware of risks. You're aware of risks of people challenging you, people not liking what you're saying, and you're willing to move forward, understanding those risks and also have plans to overcome them. So what will you do if a barrier comes in your way and you need to tackle it? And advocacy will improve livelihoods for marginalized communities. So if we're changing the practices of our organizations to be more justice-centered, community-centered, and equity-centered, we know that it's going to improve the efforts of those that have been underinvested. But it's good to know that that's something you're sharing with those around you. So there's a cycle to advocacy, and it's 8 steps, kind of in its focus. First, you got to identify the issue. So what's the thing you're advocating for? How do you analyze it to understand the pros and cons of the issue, what's currently being done, and you're fully aware of what people think about the issue. Then you set your goals and objectives. So how many people are you going to convince? How many people you're going to bring on your staffing? What is your markers of success? Maybe they're a short-term and a long-term marker. Then you identify your decision makers, which we talked about in our partnerships and coalitions lecture. So these are the people that could control, whether something happens, and how to potentially convince them. You define the message and the ask. So you have what you're saying and you have the ask as in, this is what we should be doing, and I believe that we should be doing X, Y, and Z. The timeline. So sometimes, there's a moment in history, as we're living in right now, around anti-racism, where people are more interested in this work. People are more interested to make this happen. And so it might be that is the time that you strike and you advocate for what you want and to know the community's need. You then want to assess your resources, you choose your tactics, and you implement. So you're, knowing what you have, knowing the access, the money that you can implement, your tactics, maybe letter campaigns, petitioning, lots of meetings, and then you can implement on those efforts. You're going to monitor and evaluate to see, do I get the wins that I want, the numbers that I want? Is this really being successful, or do I need to reevaluate and move back to change tactics? And then 8 is to share the wins and of the best practices that you learned to both yourself and other advocates. So then when you do this all over again, you're ready to do it even better the second time. So that's the advocacy cycle. And my closing thoughts. I just believe, as long as you remain driven by supporting communities and uplifting equity, you will find the supporters to grow your work. It may be difficult. It may require a lot of research, but there are people out there that believe in you. I believe in you, and I'm here to support you in whatever you need. And I believe that this is work that needs to be done, and I'm so happy you've joined us in this journey. If you want to continue your learning, here's a few books around design and justice, as well as around the broken, system of philanthropy and social impact, to get your minds going and think better about how you do justice-centered work. Thanks again. My email, again, is always on these slides, but feel free to contact me at any time. And if you're interested in an exit interview, please let me know. I will be sending out a survey to assess your success in the course. So please fill that out, because that will be essential as I work on growing this effort out to benefit people that want to do this work. So thank you so much, and catch y'all sometime soon.